And we are back on the 0 hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and the question that everyone is asking in Washington, D.C., are you down with TPP? That, by the way, is a very retro hip-hop reference that my next guest probably won't get, and I'm a little embarrassed that I even said it. A good friend of mine joining us now, Dave Johnson, senior fellow with the Campaign for America's Future, and I don't think he's down with TPP, but he'll tell us. Dave, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Richard. No, I'm not so much down with TPP.
Well,
it's secret, so we don't know what's in it.
That's true. And with the TPP, for those of our listeners who do not know, is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If you liked NAFTA, some of us would argue you will love the TPP. But if you didn't like the job loss and so on, some of us will argue then you will not like TPP. So first of all, let's start with this. Now, this is something that the White House and the Republicans agree on, and most Democrats on the Hill do not agree with. Is that a fair statement?
It looks that way, yeah. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is a massive trade agreement currently being negotiated in secret, using the processes that have led to the previous trade agreements. But previous trade agreements, there was a lot more discussion out there. I mean, I'm old enough to remember NAFTA, and NAFTA was a huge debate. National discussion, but you'll find that very, very few people know anything about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The media is just basically not bothering to cover it. You know, it's a policy discussion, so they don't cover that kind of stuff anymore. They do cover if there's a controversy. You know, if Elizabeth Warren shows up and opposes it, they say, oh, well, there's a division. Anyway, this massive trade agreement, which is secret, is coming along one of these days, and they're trying to push something called Fast Track, also called formerly Trade Promotion Authority, to grease the skids on it. Now, here's where the real problem with all of this lies, is that the Fast Track process means that Congress sets aside all kinds of things that Congress is supposed to do. They agree that within 90 days of this treaty being presented, they will have voted on it. They have 90 days to finish and vote. They agree not to amend it. They agree to limit the amount of debate that they do, and they agree that it has to have an up or down vote. Even though there's been more than 400 filibusters in the last few years, they will not filibuster this. So Fast Track is designed to push this thing through, and 90 days does not give anyone time to understand it. And if there's problems with it, which we don't know, of course, it's secret, but if there's problems, too bad. So that's what's up, Richard.
So that's a great summary, actually. And among other things, if people... one could almost create an argument that says, okay, I get why you can't amend it because it was negotiated among all these countries, and if you amend it, it's got to be renegotiated. I might not agree with that, but at least I get the logic. I do not get any logical argument that says we need to limit debate on this. I don't see where that comes in. Why can't people say whatever they want to say in the halls of Congress, or on the floor of Congress, in favor of or against this bill?
Well, it's not just that, in fact. I mean, there's a part of the whole idea comes out of this thing called the Constitution, is that Congress is supposed to set the terms, set the objectives, even the negotiating partners. And we're bypassing that. This time, usually the idea of Fast Track is that Congress says, okay, go negotiate this treaty, and sets down the terms, what they want, the objectives. This is what we want this treaty to be about and to accomplish. Now, this treaty comes along in secret without Congress having done that. It's just kind of showing up and being presented to us. And the current, this is insider stuff, but the current debate going on right now as they're trying to get a fast-track bill is that one side wants to say, okay, well, we're going to put objectives in this fast-track bill, but if the objectives aren't met, then we'd like to be able to revoke fast-track procedure and go back to the normal constitutional procedure for this bill. And the other side says, oh, no, you can't do that, the side that really wants to push this through. So there is a big indication of something, that it's not just about limiting debate, but they're actually trying to rig fast track so that if fast track doesn't even do what Congress wants, they still have to vote limited. It's under this enormous PR pressure we're going to have from the corporations, and I think we'll get to something about that in a few minutes.
I think we will.
Yeah, and so with this enormous pressure going on, and then here we are, we find out that the bill doesn't even, or the treaty doesn't even contain what Congress wants. They still can't set aside this rigged process that pushes it through. So there's another indication. Here's the thing. This is being sold now as, who do you want to write the rules, China or the United States? They're not talking about just trade rules here. They're talking about, in many ways, because of some of the things that looks like are in this massive treaty, we're talking about the rules for governance in the 21st century world, okay? Because there's parts of this that bypass the sovereignty of countries with corporate courts and things like that. And anyway, so...
And I wanted to get to that, but let me just jump in for a second. I do want to get to the sovereignty issue, but before that, I just want to say, so you're saying basically that the state of debate in Congress right now is such that people not only are going to be expected to vote on this with limited debate, limited time frame, and a lot of pressure, but they can't even, in advance of it, vote on principles or goals that they want it to meet. So basically, it's a very stacked deck. And now let's get to that. Now everybody's saying, we haven't.
Let me correct that.
Okay.
They can in advance say the goals that they want to meet, but they don't matter. In other words, too bad if they don't meet that. That's what they're trying to add here. Yeah.
Okay, so even worse. And I guess, everyone is saying, well, we haven't seen the actual bill yet, but portions, first of all, as my understanding is that about 600 lobbyists and other corporate employees have seen it, but no members of Congress haven't. The public hasn't. Secondly, some elements of it have been, in my understanding, at least in draft form, have been leaked out, including this whole issue of sovereignty, which I think people don't fully realize how deep the implications of this whole sovereignty issue are. And so let's talk about that for a second. What do we really mean when we say, I guess it has courts, international courts, and hearing provisions and all that actually override the individual governance abilities of countries in the deal, right?
Yeah. First of all, members of Congress can see it, but you ought to hear the terms under which they're allowed to see it. But in other words, it's very limited what they can see. There's a section of disagreement and agreements in the past called the investor-state dispute settlement. Now, trade agreements, if you do a trade agreement with let's say some South American banana republic, but you want to do a trade agreement with them, and the people there would benefit from this, and you'd benefit. So you put in a clause that says that this government, they put in a mechanism so that if this government, like let's say, seizes your oil refinery or something, then there's got to be a way to get around that banana republic's ability to do that. So they put in investor-state dispute settlement that overrides that country's processes, and the country agrees to it when they sign the agreement, and takes it to another adjudicating body. That's the basis of the idea of this, is that there is a need for it in some cases, where you want to do a trade agreement, you got to get around what they're doing in this country that doesn't work for investors who would want to, invest in an oil refinery in this country, for example. They're not going to do it if the country can just take the oil refinery after you put your money down. Fine. Well, this now applies to democratic governments and their court systems. And when you ask why, you get these arrogant answers about we don't want the kind of interference that people on a whim can just put up. In other words, democracies
right.
to have laws.
And I think it goes much deeper than something relatively clear cut, like the seizing of a refinery without compensation or whatever.
Exactly.
It goes into things, for example, if I recall correctly, such as one of the countries in a previous agreement, it might have been Canada, I'm not sure, passed a law requiring that tuna fish or something be labeled, the labeling of food, for example.
No,
you're not allowed to.
Right. The dolphin safe.
The dolphin safe.
Mexican fishing companies sued us because people might not buy as many cans of tuna fish if it's not marked dolphin safe.
Right. If they might be eating flipper. So
tobacco companies are suing countries for trying to protect the health of their citizens by doing things like having plain label packaging or anti-smoking campaigns. Well, the tobacco companies, under these kinds of provisions in trade agreements, can sue these countries and take this to what's called a corporate court. The adjudication body isn't the courts of the country. It's a panel of corporate arbitrators, okay? Corporate lawyers who then decide whether the country is inappropriately seizing the profits of this company. Actually suing, and it's very expensive, so some smaller countries have had to back down rather than try to pay to adjudicate this and protect their citizens, okay? This is actually happening. Now, there's a problem, of course, as we know from our arbitration clauses in our credit cards, etc., that the arbitrators also want future business of one sort or another. These are corporate attorneys who, in other occasions, when they're not adjudicating these things, are going to be representing corporations, or they might want to do this again as an adjudicator, and if they rule against the corporation, they don't get future business, and they know it. So these things have been shown not to work. In our arbitration clauses, I think the corporations win this huge percentage of the time, for example, as a result of that.
And I think a couple other issues before we go off this this topic. One is the question of these proceedings not being open to the public, and the second is who picks the, so to speak, the judges, the panelists who decide all this stuff.
Right, and it is.
And
in
who
other
does?
Words, they're saying that the court system of the United States is not adequate, not qualified to rule on these disputes. And the fact that they can bring this kind of a dispute to the courts, it overrides American sovereignty. There might have been reasons for that when you're dealing with a banana republic. There are no reasons for that when you're dealing with trade treaties between modern, sophisticated countries with developed legal systems. So that's one of the potential items that's going to be a problem. Now, from the time it took us here to discuss this, you start getting the idea of why 90 days is a problem on the public finding out about these things, reading them, analyzing, getting experts who can, interpret what this means, and then, if warranted, organized opposition to go before the Congress and say, wait a minute, this is a problem, don't vote for this. 90 days is not enough time.
And we're going to go to a break and continue, but two quick thoughts before we go to a break. Number one, sure. It always gets me that the guys who are the conservatives who are outraged at the thought of American troops being directed by foreign officers in a peacekeeping force are happy with American courts being overridden by corporate courts from other countries. That's number one. And number two is, we'll get to that after the break. We're going to go to a break with Dave Johnson from the Campaign for America's Future talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We'll be right back. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour with Dave Johnson from the Campaign for America's Future. I'm Richard RJ Eskow. We are talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And, Dave, before we went to break, we talked about this 90-day limit on debate. One of the things that gets me that you and I were just talking about earlier by email, the defenders of this deal, whom are many, who I would describe as the usual suspects behind NAFTA and some of the other deals, the defenders of this deal say, how can you oppose it? You haven't even seen it yet, but they won't let us see it. So maybe we should talk a minute about how this thing is being spun and sold. And that's one of the key arguments. Gosh, you guys are opposing it when you'll be blown away by how wonderful it is. Well, A, the advanced word isn't so wonderful. B, if it's so great, why can't we see it?
Exactly. The secrecy of this is a big problem. And even members of Congress are complaining about the secrecy. Keith Ellison the other day was speaking at a press conference where a number of organizations were voicing their opposition to fast track and to this agreement. And he said he went to see it. He has to go alone to this room where there's monitors who are employed by the trade people, the negotiators. He can't write down. He can't take notes. He can't bring with him his staff expert who understands the weird international legalese these things are written in, who can then interpret to him what these clauses mean and everything. He's not allowed to see the whole agreement, just parts. And he might have time, but he's a busy person. He's a member of Congress. He's got to get back for votes and things like that. So while they give access, the access they give isn't really access. It doesn't give. It's like this 90 days, from the time we first see it, they're supposed to vote. For him, it doesn't give him and the people he can ask the questions are the representatives of the negotiators who are in the room. Now, that's just not a process that works for transparency. Now, just for example.
Do we know roughly how long this thing is in terms of number of pages?
I don't know. It's 20-some chapters. Only a few of them have actually to do with trade, for example, actual trade. And the people who have seen it are not allowed to talk about it, but they have said, some of them who have seen it have said, we aren't going to like it. Now, we're getting, of course, the administration selling it, saying it's going to have these amazing environmental and labor standards that we're all going to love. And some of their campaigners say that. I'm trying to find out if those campaigners have actually read it or if they're just getting paid to say it. So,
we'll let's talk about some of those campaigners a little bit. First of all, I mean, maybe they're just protecting us from the euphoria that would come over us when we finally see it. But assuming that is not the case, I will be a little more skeptical than that. There has been some, you mentioned people who might be getting paid to promote it. There was a group that claimed it was a progressive pro-jobs group for the TPP.
Right.
Behind it was, tell us about that.
This group popped up called the Progressive Coalition for American Jobs with a website. It's PCAJ. Darn, it's not in front of me. It's either .com or .org, okay? And it just came out of nowhere. So you go to their website and take a look, and it's all about how we're going to progressives and Democrats have this coalition, and we're just also happy with what's in the treaty because it does this with labor rules and this with environment, all of these things. And about how, of course, we're now finding ourselves writing the rules for the 21st century. All of these things. So I started looking into who it was, and it comes from a few people that were in the Clinton campaign who formed one of these PR marketing agencies and who are now closely associated with the coming Hillary campaign. And the organization is 270 Strategies. I tried to get in touch to find out a few things, like who's funding this, have you read it, or, upon what do you base these assertions about how we're all going to love the labor agreements, and, those basic questions. Did not get an answer. So I finally put out this post where I looked at, okay, the first thing is, progressive. I can't find any progressives who are in favor of this treaty and this process. We might all, like you say, we might all flock to it, although the process with which it's being negotiated and sold makes that suspect.
Yeah, and let's just be clear. We're talking with Dave Johnson from the Campaign for America's Future about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The likelihood of that is infinitesimally small based on the fact that it's being brought to us by the same fine folks who gave us NAFTA, based on the fact that there has been no coherent economic argument that suggests it will create jobs or benefit the majority as opposed to the wealthy few, and based on the process itself and what that tells us, based on the leaks we've had about what's in it, there's no reason to believe we're not going to do anything but continue to adamantly oppose it. And I'm sure you agree with
and based on one more thing, and that's the recent, a few years ago, Korea Free Trade Agreement we just signed, and which has already cost 70,000 jobs in the United States and has already greatly increased our trade deficit with that country. And a trade deficit is really a measure of how much leakage out of our economy of jobs and prosperity is going on. So the template for this, the Korean trade agreement, is also already really hurting this country. It's probably making a few billionaires a lot richer, and a few corporations become more dominant. But for most of us, especially the steel industry, it's causing a big problem. So there's also that, yeah.
So great point. Glad you added that. And now we've got, so there's going to be a pitch to that there's something progressive about this, that the wealth it brings to a few will somehow translate into jobs, despite the evidence. This is a slight diversion, Dave, but I'm going to take it anyway. What the heck? The word progressive, it's getting to mean, it's either being abused more and more, or it's meaning less than less to me. I don't know what you think, but...
Well, they're trying to play a trick. I think they're trying to play a trick with the word there this is a progressive agreement is how they're going to sell it. It's trying to inoculate themselves from arguments that'll come from progressives.
Well, Third Way, the Wall Street funded group, they call themselves progressive too. It reminds me of what happened. It reminds me of what happened to the word reform, which used to mean, the great, people fighting for unionization, and after the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire for safety in the workplace, these were the great reformers of the 19th and 20th century. Now reform means cutting Social Security.
Yep.
So I worry about that.
This group's big claim is that it's going to create hundreds of thousands of American jobs. Well, so here's the problem with that, is that that claim has been looked at by a number of economists, etc., who look at these things. The Washington Post fact checker took a look at that claim and awarded it 4 Pinocchios, because the economists all agree, and as Krugman wrote just the other day, the effect of this treaty on things like jobs, GDP growth, and such will be minimal, because it doesn't really affect anything we don't already have in place. So
what does that mean exactly?
Well, there's this argument that we have all these barriers to trade, et cetera, around the world. Well, we don't anymore. Tariffs are relatively low. Krugman's got the best argument the other day at his blog, that this actually isn't really going to make that much difference in terms of actual trade. The world's got a lot of trade going on already, and this really isn't going to affect that in very much of a way. I mean, we already have this huge trade with China, for example. We buy from them, and they don't buy from us, and we have a huge trade deficit. But an agreement like this with countries like that, the ones that the agreement's actually with, it won't make a difference. The only difference past trade agreements have made is that they've increased our trade deficit and cost jobs. So maybe we'll be lucky, and it'll just be neutral and won't cost jobs. But that gives the lie to the argument that it's going to create hundreds of thousands of jobs. So now we have to change the name of this organization from the Progressive Coalition for American Jobs to the Coalition for Pinocchios,
Well,
So
or
the
the
next thing
coalition for increased profits for a few corporations. And
exactly.
I mean,
Right.
the best case scenario is it doesn't cost us that many jobs, but we lose the right to regulate our own environmental and product labeling and some. I mean, there's no. I can't see any good scenario for it. Let's in the minute or so we have left. Let's talk about what might actually help create jobs. Now, I think this is, and we only have a minute, but.
All right.
I think
Very
this is
quickly.
another issue for you too, which is in terms of the trade deficit. Dean Baker, for example, who's on this show a lot, the economist, points out that what would really help create jobs is a cheaper dollar.
Exactly. We have a strong dollar. Everybody says, "Oh, strong dollar sounds good." No, the dollar that when you call something about a strong or cheap dollar, that's the dollar means the price of our goods on international markets versus other countries. And other countries use manipulation to lower the price of their goods in international markets. That is
Hello, China.
That is the biggest, and Japan, and fastest thing that we could fix. 5.8 million jobs from currency manipulation is one of the big estimates right now. If we addressed currency manipulation, boom, millions of jobs would come back here, and that would result in wage pressure. Wages would start going up, full employment, that whole thing.
Right.
And all of a sudden we'd start benefiting from that. The administration refuses to address currency manipulation, and the majority of Congress has already said they want rules on currency manipulation in this treaty, and our trade representative has refused to bring it up in the negotiations. So that's another example of why this agreement is suspect. The spirit of this whole thing is wrong for a modern democracy, and springing it on us with only then 90 days to vote on it for something that they're calling rewriting the rules for the 21st century. We had 90 days to look at it and vote. No.
Well, I would say that's truth in labeling because they're rewriting the legislative rules for the 21st century, but just for this. So I guess we'll have to leave it there. Dave Johnson, thanks so much for bringing us up to date on it. I guess the moral is they think we'll like it. They're telling us we'll love it when we see it, but we can't see it till it's too late. That is should be cause for suspicion. So thanks for joining us, Dave Johnson, Senior Fellow for the Campaign for America's Future.
So much.
And we will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and when it comes to the TPP, this is the Zero Hour.